For more than 400 years, a silent lie has been hanging over our children in classrooms, boardrooms, and every globe we've ever spun in school. A lie so big, so invisible, we never think to question it. But it has shaped how the world sees Africa and worse, how Africa sees itself. They tell us that Africa is small, that Europe, the United States, and even Greenland rival Africa in size, that the continent that feeds the world, fuels its industries, and is home to its oldest civilization is somehow small. But what happens when an African nation dares to say, "It's over"? What happens when a generation of Africans looks up, not down? This week, the African Union ripped off the mask with a single statement. They exposed a centuries-old lie, the map itself, and now the world is being forced to face the truth. Stay with us because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that will not be left. The Lie That Lingered. It began in 1569 with a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator. His goal was not to deceive, at least not at first. He created a map projection designed to help European sailors navigate the high seas. The lines were straight, the routes simple, but in making things convenient for ships, he distorted the world itself. The Mercator projection stretched areas near the poles Europe, North America, and Greenland while compressing the vast lands near the equator. And so, Africa, enormous, rich, alive, was made to look like a distant cousin rather than a central force. Greenland, with just over 2 million square kilometers, appeared as big as Africa, which spans over 30 million. This was no innocent distortion. As European empires expanded, the Mercator map became a tool of power, not just geography. Hung in schools, printed in textbooks, projected in war rooms, it quietly taught generation after generation that Europe was dominant and Africa was peripheral, that power was north and weakness was south, and Africa was erased in plain sight. In Britain and America, millions of children grew up thinking Africa was small, backward, insignificant. But the tragedy cuts deeper in Africa itself, because African children learned the same thing. In Lagos, Accra, Dakar, and Nairobi school walls bore maps that whispered inferiority to black children, maps that silently told them, "You don't matter." This was psychological colonization, not through chains, but through chalk, not with bullets, but with borders, and it worked. The Mercator map reinforced every stereotype. It justified colonial theft. It made underdevelopment appear natural. It helped world leaders sit at summits and trade conferences, pretending that Africa was too small to lead, too weak to decide, too poor to matter. But geography was not the only victim. Identity was too, because when a child sees their home drawn small, they grow up believing their voice should be quiet. When a continent appears shrunk, its ambition does too. This is why the lie mattered. This is why the distortion was deadly. Because it wasn't about distances or dimensions, it was about dominance. Even when Africa stood on its feet politically, the Mercator map remained on its knees, still used in newsrooms, development banks, and diplomatic maps, still used by Google Maps, still trusted, still printed, still framing the minds of those who would go on to lead. And all the while, Africa remained big in reality, but small in the world's imagination. The cartographic injustice continued long after colonial flags came down. The lie endured, unchanged, until now. That's why the African Union's recent decision to reject the Mercator projection and endorse the Equal Earth map is not just symbolic, it is revolutionary. Because to correct the map is to correct the mind. To change the image is to change the story. And to finally tell the world, Africa is not small. It never was. You made it small on paper, in policy, and in perception, but not anymore. The awakening begins. It started with a single image. On the African Union's official social media page, a new map appeared bold, unapologetic. It showed Africa as it truly is, a colossus, not a corner, not a footnote. A continent so vast it could hold the United States, China, India, Japan, Germany, France, the UK, and still have room to breathe. And in large type, The caption thundered, "Africa's true size is 37 million square kilometers." For many, it was the first time they had ever seen it. For decades, that truth had been hidden, but now it was going viral. Hashtags erupted. "Correct the map. Africa awakens. We are not small." TikTok exploded with stitched videos comparing Mercator and Equal Earth. Young Africans used their voices to say what generations before them never could. They lied to us. They made us think we were less. Not anymore. The campaign spread not through governments, but through people. Through phones, through memes, through shared outrage. On Instagram, artists redrew the world, placing Africa at the center, not the margins. On Twitter, educators posted side-by-side comparisons. Mercator versus Equal Earth. The difference was stunning. It wasn't just a map, it was a revelation. Suddenly, people began asking questions, not just about geography, but about history, about identity, about justice. How did this distortion last so long? Why did our schools use it? Why did our leaders stay silent? The answers were uncomfortable. Moki Makura, director of African No Filter, called the Mercator projection the world's longest-running misinformation campaign. In her words, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message, one designed to justify colonial dominance and economic exploitation, one that seeped into trade deals, investment ratings, even the subconscious mind of African children. Selma Malikicha Haddadi, deputy chairperson of the African Union, put it even more bluntly. It might seem to be just a map, but in reality, it is not. And she was right, because a map is more than a chart of land. It's a story of power, and for centuries, that story said, Africa is weak, Africa is behind, Africa needs help. But when Africa is drawn to scale, truly to scale, that story collapses. For older generations, the revelation stirred shame and anger. Years spent looking at classroom maps that made Africa look like an afterthought. Teachers posting online, confessing they had unknowingly passed on the lie. One wrote, "I feel like I taught my students to see themselves as less. That hurts more than I can say." For the youth, it was a moment of pride, of reclamation, of power. In Lagos, students organized a map reclamation day at their university. In Cape Town, a street mural replaced an old school map with the Equal Earth version 20 feet tall, painted in bold colors. In Accra, teachers printed out the new map and taped it over old atlases in defiance. And online, a phrase began to spread. We are not small. We never were. That awakening didn't stop at Africa's borders. Diaspora communities in Atlanta, London, and Paris held community gatherings. Equal Earth maps were handed out at Pan-African events. Children in Harlem and Brixton looked at their roots and saw something different. Not weakness, not charity, but scale, depth, centrality. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And that's what makes this awakening irreversible. The Mercator map is not just inaccurate, it's obsolete. And now, for the first time in centuries, Africans and the world are ready to say it out loud. The political earthquake. The tremor didn't stop with social media. Across parliaments, universities, and ministries, the Equal Earth map landed like a challenge. The African Union's declaration had done more than reveal a truth. It had exposed a lie that too many leaders had accepted for too long, and people were furious. In cities from Nairobi to Dakar, citizens began asking hard, necessary questions. If our continent is this vast, this resource-rich, why do our leaders still act like beggars? If we're big enough to hold half the world inside us, why are we treated like the world's charity case? These were not rhetorical questions. They were indictments. For decades, African governments signed away land, minerals, water, and oil, accepting unfair deals from foreign companies and international institutions. Those deals were made under the shadow of Mercator's lie, a lie that said Africa was too poor to negotiate, too weak to lead, too dependent to demand fairness. But now, that lie was collapsing. The political pressure surged. Opposition parties seized the moment. In Ghana, MPs held up the Equal Earth map during parliamentary debates, accusing the ruling government of psychological betrayal. In Kenya, student unions rallied on university campuses, demanding that all textbooks be replaced with new, corrected maps. Even school children joined the call. In Senegal, a teacher shared that after showing the new map, one student asked, "If our land is this big, why are we borrowing money from smaller places?" There was no easy answer. That's because the lie of the map had always served those in power, both abroad and at home. Western governments used it to justify military bases, trade imbalance, and political interference. But African elites used it too to excuse corruption, failure, and dependency. And now, they were being held accountable. Civil society roared to life. Campaigns swept across digital spaces. Map Justice, Redraw Africa, Equal Earth Now. Petitions flew towards education ministries, demanding curriculum reforms. Activists published open letters to African presidents asking, "Why did you remain silent when our children were made to feel small?" And the institutions began to shake. In Ethiopia, the AU headquarters hosted a special session on geography and dignity, the first of its kind. Delegates debated not just maps, but power, perception, and politics. Some tried to downplay the issue as symbolic. Others, especially younger delegates, pushed back fiercely. If you control the image, you control the future. Meanwhile, international organizations scrambled to catch up. The World Bank announced it would phase out Mercator projections in all new reports. The United Nations geospatial body received a formal petition to standardize Equal Earth as default in Africa-focused documentation. But the most powerful shift came from the people. In households across the continent, Equal Earth maps replaced Mercator ones. Children pointed to the new shape of their home and smiled with recognition. "Papa, Africa is big." Yes, it always was. And as that truth sank in, a new expectation rose. No longer would citizens tolerate leaders who bowed before foreign interests while standing on land vast enough to feed the world. No longer would people accept trade deals written in weakness, because now they knew the truth. Africa wasn't behind. It was buried under layers of distortion, deceit, and silence. And now that it had risen, it would not bow again. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Amid the roar of awakening, one voice cut through louder, sharper, fiercer. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, just 35 years old, stood before his people and the world with a message that was not filtered, not softened, and not diplomatic. "We are not small," he thundered. "We are giants. They made us crawl." This wasn't the first time Traoré had challenged the status quo. Since rising to power in 2022, he has rejected the traditional playbook of African politics, refusing to be a puppet, refusing to play polite. But this moment, the African Union's decision to back the Equal Earth map seemed like a chapter he had written years ago, long before the AU moved. Traoré had warned of what he called psychological colonization. Not just soldiers, he said, not just banks or borders, but maps, symbols, stories. He told crowds in Ouagadougou that every Mercator map on a school wall was a weapon, a tool used to shrink the African child's mind before they even spoke. Captain Ibrahim's latest news was now more than military reform or expelling foreign troops. It was this, reclaiming the African mind. And across the continent, his words struck a chord. In Senegal, posters of Traoré appeared on university campuses next to the Equal Earth map. In Tanzania, young activists quoted his speeches at rallies, "We are giants." In Nigeria, a street artist painted a mural of Traoré standing over a shrunken Mercator globe, tearing it apart with his hands. For many, Traoré had become more than a president. He was a symbol of an Africa that had stopped asking for permission, that no longer whispered in the back room, but stood at the podium. And yet, not all were comfortable. Some African elites accused him of being too radical, too disruptive. They said his words could destabilize delicate relations with the West. But for the youth, for the diaspora, for the millions who had grown up seeing Africa drawn small, he was necessary. Because while others had tolerated the lie, he had called it out. He had demanded that the African Union act. He had questioned why maps taught in schools made Europe look powerful, and Africa look poor. He had challenged silence and forced action, and now, with the AU's declaration, many gave credit where it was due. Captain Ibrahim's latest news was not just trending, it was transforming, and the movement spread. In Burkina Faso, teachers replaced classroom maps overnight. One principal said, "If our president can face the world, we can face the truth." In Mali, a group of young filmmakers began a documentary titled Redrawing Dignity, with Traoré's speeches as the opening narration. In the African diaspora, churches held prayer circles for new leadership, calling Traoré the Joshua of this generation. And across comment sections online, a single question echoed, "If he can speak truth, why can't ours?" That question burned through palaces and parliaments because Traoré had raised the bar. No longer was it acceptable for African presidents to read speeches written by foreign consultants. No longer would polite smiles at summits be seen as diplomacy. The people wanted truth, fire, vision. They wanted leaders who didn't just manage poverty, but shattered the systems that caused it. And so, the awakening became a reckoning, not just with the West, but with Africa's own reflection. Burkina Faso. Latest news wasn't about tanks or treaties. It was about transformation, about the youngest president on the continent holding up the oldest truth, that Africa is not small. It never was. And if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Dignity redrawn. In classrooms once ruled by silence, a new sound began to rise. Pride. Maps were coming down. Mercator maps, those quiet tools of humiliation, were being folded, trashed, burned. In their place, the equal Earth projection was taped, pinned, projected onto whiteboards. For the first time, African children were seeing Africa as it truly is: vast, central, undeniable. And something shifted. A headmistress in Senegal told reporters, "For 20 years, I taught my children that they lived in a small land. Now, I tell them they belong to a giant." Her voice trembled not with shame, but with determination. Across the continent, a revolution unfolded not with weapons, but with walls. Murals bloomed across Accra, Johannesburg, Kigali. Artists painted Africa large, colorful, rich with symbolism. School children traced borders with crayons, marveling at how their homeland dwarfed entire continents. Parents cried. Teachers cheered. Elders nodded, whispering, "We always knew. Now they will know too." The equal Earth projection was not just a cartographic correction, it was a spiritual restoration. University lectures changed overnight. Geography professors opened classes with slides comparing the Mercator and equal Earth maps. Discussions once limited to measurements became soul-deep conversations on identity, power, and perception. Workshops titled Decolonize the Map attracted hundreds. One speaker declared, "This isn't a map, it's a mirror, and we finally see ourselves." In diaspora communities across London, Toronto, and New York, African parents hung the new map in living rooms. Youth groups printed them on t-shirts. Afro-Caribbean schools in Brooklyn replaced geography handouts. Elders held storytelling sessions about how their own parents had been taught lies and why this truth must now be guarded. The psychological shift was colossal because this wasn't just about landmass. It was about legitimacy. If Africa was this big, this central, then its people were too. And with that truth came expectations. Young people began asking, if we're this powerful on paper, why aren't we powerful in policy? If we can house half the world inside our borders, why do our leaders kneel for loans? These questions weren't just intellectual, they were spiritual. They demanded answers, and slowly, the answers began to come. Some governments launched initiatives to reform curriculum content, ensuring children learned using the equal Earth projection. Ministries of Education held national consultations. Civic groups printed wall-sized versions of the map for public display. But the most important transformation was internal. For centuries, Africans were taught to think small, to accept small roles in global narratives, small shares in global trade, small voices at global tables. But now, the map was honest, and with honesty came ambition, because once you know the truth, you can't live by the lie. For centuries, the world looked at Africa through a lie, a map that shrank a giant into a child. That turned a cradle of civilization into a corner of the earth. That made a land of gold, oil, diamonds, music, genius look fragile, poor, and powerless. But now, that lie is over. The Mercator map may still hang on some walls, but its power is broken. The silence is shattered. The truth is loose, and truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. The African Union's decision to endorse the equal Earth projection is more than geography. It is justice. It is history rebalanced. It is dignity redrawn. But the map alone is not enough. If this awakening stops at symbols, then our ancestors' pain will have been for nothing. If textbooks stay the same, if trade deals remain unfair, if leaders continue to bow in the boardrooms of Brussels and Washington, then this revolution will have been a picture, not a promise. The real battle begins now, in the classrooms, in the parliaments, in the boardrooms, in the mirror. Will Africa rise in truth or fall back into silence? Will Ibrahim Traoré's vision endure or be replaced by those who fear change? We must watch. We must speak. We must demand, because Africa is not small. It never was, and now that we see her clearly, we must never let her shrink again. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Burkina Faso, latest news. This is our story now. Africa rise.